So I'm going to run through that very, very briefly, like quickly, and then I'll continue with what I want to share today. So what I'm going to do is I just want to share. Let me, sorry, need to check the screens here. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint. Just let me know if you can see the PowerPoint.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So let me open it here. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to switch screens here. But anyway, so never mind. So I started the series on self-awareness because I had somebody that asked me in one of the previous lessons, they asked me, because we work with athletes, I don't know, with whom do you work?
Hello?
Hi, can you
Yes.
hear me? Whom do you work? Who are the people that you work with?
Okay, so I'm at a private school in Johannesburg, and so I'm coaching athletes. You know, I'm also helping with you know, rugby players and their speed and agility. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, perfect. So yeah, well, I had a question from a coach previously that asked me, okay, how do you teach an athlete to become self-aware? And he was mostly talking about the fact that you have an athlete, they're doing certain things, but they don't see that they're doing some things wrong, or they don't have the insight, because you as a coach want to share that with them, but they either don't think they do anything wrong, or they just don't have the self-awareness to do that. So that's sort of where this session came from. And I've explained yeah, sorry, I did press record, right?
Yes, you did.
Yeah. So I've explained in the previous session, it is, we cannot teach anybody, and I guess as a teacher you would also know this, but we cannot teach, or an educator, we cannot teach somebody, give them a lesson and now they suddenly have self-awareness. A lot of self-awareness is something, they need to get the insights, and they need to be able to get to that point where they have more or develop more self-awareness. But there are questions that we as coaches can ask the players and athletes to help them to sort of take them to that place where they become more self-aware. So and it's all about how we are becoming more self-aware about our emotions, our behavior, and then subsequently our identity. So in that previous session, I explained this very briefly to people, that we all take in information through our 5 senses, and our brain processes the information. We all get it from the outside world. That's how we learn. That's how we go through life. There's no other way for us to process information. And we, like I said, do it through our 5 senses. But what happens is that that information that comes in from our environment, we apply, our minds and brain apply certain rules to it, because we cannot take in all the millions bits of information that come in and process it. Our brains will just explode. So we delete, our brains delete some of the information. It actually distorts it, or it will generalize it. And those are the things that I'm actually focusing on. If people do that unknowingly, they wouldn't, because we all do that based on our past experiences and the filter through which we look at life. But if people do that, what are the questions that we can ask them to sort of get them out of that place of where they are and where they just dismiss some information, or they generalized things like that. Then, oh yeah, and I did mention that the whole goal of this was to give you guys a set of questions that's designed specifically to challenge and expand the limit of that person's model of the world. So we all have like I don't like to call it boundaries, but we all have a little boundary in which we operate, and that's how we see the world, but really to help them to expand that boundary. This comes from NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. It is in NLP what we would call a meta model. And what they did really years ago, and the people that came up with this, was to identify people that have have interviews and have sessions with people, therapy, coaching sessions, and to see how the successful sessions, what are the questions that they ask them, and that sort of also help the people to explain how they think. So I spoke the previous time, I spoke very briefly about generalization. One of the things that we do with information that comes in, and that's when people talk about, you will hear it in people's sentences, they will talk about nobody, no one loves me, everyone is against me, I never get to play, I always are on the back foot, and these are referred to also as 100% words, that it's like in that person's mind there's no exception. I think we get that a lot with teenagers, right? So they like you talk a lot like that. And the whole idea of that is to find the exception and then help that person to determine whether that's really true. So that's what we did the previous time. And I gave examples on specific questions that people can, or well, the coach can ask is, if somebody says it always rains when I have a race, then the whole concept of it is you actually just repeat that word. You can either just say always, or always rain when you have a race. See, there's this typing error, really every single time. So if somebody says all coaches are lying, really all of them, so just sort of repeat that word that they are using, that always. Another example, if an athlete comes and says, I've messed up everything, ask them, so you've messed up everything, really every single thing? So that sort of will help them to, they might come back and say, well, not every single thing, and then that opens up the conversation for them to think about that. All right, so yeah, and I've just shared some other examples. So what I want to talk about today is we get 3 types of what we would call modal operators. And when we talk about, well, I've mentioned those, but when we talk about generalizations, when we generalize information, we also get 3 types. And the one is what we would call, people don't have to remember this, but a universal quantifier. That's the one where people uses the words like always, everything, everybody. And then we also get what I'm going to talk about today is modal operators of necessity and possibility. So it's exactly as the name suggests. It is how people operate. It's a mode of how a person operates, and you also get 3 types. People can operate out of a mode of possibility. They can operate out of a mode of necessity, or there's another one, desirability. And possibility, I've just listed all of the words that are involved in there, but possibility are words like I can, I could, I may, I might. Necessary is should, ought to, must, I need to. And then desirability is love to or I like to. Now, the modal operator here is just really an adverb that's in front of a verb. And when people use these phrases in their speaking, it's really we say what we would call talk about in NLP. It's out of place of necessity and obligation, and it provides a level of compellingness that they have to do something. So depending on which of these they use, we are able to understand how it is that they are really internally motivating themselves. Based on the language. And this is something I didn't mention in the beginning, is the neuro-linguistic programming is really about, well, when we process information in our brain from what we take in from the environment, it will always come out in the language that we speak, always. We often hear people that will say, oh, but I didn't mean it that way, or I don't mean that, but there's really, it always comes, it's a fascinating field, and it always comes out in the language that people use. So the language that people speak and the words that we all use really reflect the way that we perceive things in our mind from our environment. if we listen to these words also that people use, it really gives us an indication and help us to identify the boundaries of that person's thinking or someone else's thinking. And almost like, where's the edge of their, what we would say, mental map, the whole concept of things mentally for them. Now, I do, and I didn't highlight them specifically because it's not necessarily for the audience or for you guys to remember that, but I want to highlight the words, the modal operators that we normally use and people tend to use out of necessity, because that's normally the one that provides people, that can create stressful states for people or stressful situations or how they feel, almost every time self-imposed, and that can really be disabling for some athletes specifically. We seldom, as an athlete, we seldom question whether we have to do certain activities. It's always or whether we have to feel a certain way. We don't really examine what's the real consequences. It's just always like the words come out, I have to do this, and I must do that. This concept of necessity thinking also diverts us actually from other important outcomes, and it can really create a tunnel vision. I think we've seen that in the last 2 years with people with high, and even children and athletes with high level of anxiety. It's very hard to get them, and even in instances where we've experienced it, it's very hard to get out of that place where you are just focusing on this one thing. Now, it can be useful, those modal operators of necessity, because there can be an element of motivation for some people in there. It can drive people to complete deadlines, and it can be useful for people to meet important goals, but then we just have to ask at what cost, because obviously there are people that I've listened to an interview of a football coach from Europe. Actually, he was a player that was so driven because of the way that he was seeking that whole validation about to show people that he can do it, which just completely drove him to success, which is great, but he had to give up certain things which he now regret. Not that he had a bad life, but there will always be something that people, so there needs to be a balance. We want to see to what extent do people use this or have this mode of operating out of necessity. Now, if you look at examples, let me just see how I can move this thing. If you look at the examples, yeah, I've mentioned this. So if we look at the words and they specifically related to this, if you think about a goal that you have, let's say I want to be the best let's say rugby coach, and if you use each one of these, it will give you a different sense of how you feel and a different sense of how you think about it. Like I like to be a good rugby coach. I love to be a good rugby coach. Even there's a difference between the two. And if you talk about, I need to be a good rugby coach, or I have to be a good rugby coach, I must be a good rugby coach, that's even different than saying, I may be a good rugby coach, I could be a good rugby coach, or I can be a good rugby coach. So looking at these, even there are elements of differences between these, what we would call modal operators, and how people might use them. When we have a conversation with somebody and they use these words, how can we challenge their thinking to help them to sort of think wider and expand their mental map or their motivational boundaries that they have? One of the two things that there are two main things that we can ask them, two main questions. The one thing is we can ask them, what stops you? And I'm going to run through some examples. What stops you? And the other one is, what happened if you did? Now, there's a difference between the two. If you dive a little bit deeper into those two questions, when you ask somebody what stops you, that comes from a historical place. So they will tend to tell you all of the things that will stop them, and they will tend to spiral down back into this whole thing of all of the reasons and justifications as to why they cannot do it, which can be difficult to get the person out of that conversation. You could go there if you know how to drive the conversation further. But if you know you're dealing with a person that always spirals down into that negative rabbit hole and list all the reasons and give all the justifications as to why they cannot do something, the best question for them to ask them then is, what would happen if you did? So the great thing about that question is you're really helping the individual to push past the hinders and identify the consequences of doing something. And positively thinking about the consequences for something they thought they couldn't do, and the other side around as well. If they didn't do it, what would be the consequences of that? And what that now allows you to do is it allows you to open up the conversation. So I'm going to quickly go back and run through examples here. Let me just get to my slides. Okay. So how do you challenge the statement? So let's say, oh, I see that is actually the presentation that doesn't show everything. So let me take this out of presentation mode. Oh, I see this actually in the download. So the sentence, I'll fix it before I send out some notes. But when you, let me see what will happen. Yeah. When you tell something, we can't implement that. You can ask the person, okay, what if we did? What will happen if we do implement that? Especially when you're working with a team and you explain my big game strategy with them and somebody just says, we can't implement that. What would happen if we did? And then you can even go further and ask, what would happen if we did not implement that? If you have an athlete that would say, I cannot focus today on my training, or I cannot focus at all today, what prevents you or stops you from focusing? Now, this is that question where you could have a person that will go down the rabbit hole and sort of go down all of the reasons and everything that's wrong in their life. So unless you know how to navigate that conversation with that individual, then the best would be is, what would happen if you are focused today, and what would not happen if you're not going to be focused today? Maybe another question, an athlete might come and say, I cannot train today, I'm too tired to train today, or I just cannot train today. What would happen? Oh, sorry, this was, I must train today. So if they come and say, I must train today, what would happen if you didn't train today? And that will sort of help them to expand their thinking about, okay, what did I just say? And also for you to open up the conversation. So I know I've lost some of my audience, but I hope, so that's the short of it. If you have somebody that actually uses these words, the main thing is to pick up these words first of all. The same way I explained the previous time as to how you can do it is if you pick one person, let's say for the day or for the week, and you listen to what they're saying and you pick up on these words. You don't necessarily have, and even in a conversation, they don't even necessarily have to speak to you, but practice to pick this up in a conversation. And then you can ask yourself, okay, if I had to ask this person now, what would stop you? Or what would happen if you do not? Or if you do, what they might answer back versus where the current conversation is going. So that's something you can do in your mind while you're sitting in a conversation. And yeah, pick a person, pick an athlete, pick somebody, colleague or an athlete, and try to identify these words as it becomes easier. It really becomes easier. Once you get accustomed to listening out for these words, it really becomes easier. And in a few weeks, it's a natural thing for you as an individual or a coach to ask them the follow-up questions so that you can open up the conversation in a better way. So that's like the practical side of things. If there are any questions, feel free to email me at info@explosiveminds.com. You're more than welcome to email me. If you want me to speak about something specific for your coaches or for your athletes, something that you've picked up, something you want me maybe to address, something you have seen that you don't know how to navigate through, whether it's athletes or coaches, you can send me an email and I can put something together around that as well. I do these sessions once a month. People have asked me, why do I do that? But just because I know there are information that I can share and things that I can teach, especially coaches, since I work as a coach myself and I work with other coaches and athletes. So yeah, I do hope I'll see you guys in the next session next month. Have a great long weekend. Bye.